Is this one of the ones you were slated to burn this year?
We burned it, yeah. So this is burned twice. So that was the break between the two units.
Fire management in Western North Carolina has some unique challenges. There's a lot of diverse topography, which is the foundation for ecological diversity, different ecozones, as we call them, that occur on relatively small geographic scales. And we have more acres of wildland-urban interface than any other state in the country. Southern Appalachian forests have a strong fire history and a strong history of burning, both from Native Americans and Europeans up to the early 20th century, when, like so many places, we began an era of fire suppression, which threw our entire natural fire regime out of whack. Over the last 20 or so years, we've been working to get more good fire on the ground, whether it's managed wildfire or controlled burning. But restoring our fire-adapted ecosystems is really a story about the partnerships and the networks that have made the work on the ground possible. It's a story about relationships. I traveled up to Lake James State Park, about an hour outside of Asheville, North Carolina, to visit some of these burn sites and hear some of the collaborators who are working to manage this landscape.
Can you stand sort of uphill here?
So today we're at the long Arm Peninsula, where Linville Gorge dumps out into Lake James. And this is an area that we've burned 2 times now, first in 2015 or 2016 and 2021. So 2 fires, 5 years apart. So kind of the goals of the burn were to reduce hazardous fuels. This was a project funded by the U.S. Forest Service on the Community Protection Program.
Peninsula itself, it has a centerline ridge top that fades down to the lake, which was once valleys and river bottoms before the lake was created. It's a man-made lake. And so these ridge tops would have been dry and much more fire adapted and soft frequent fire. And after hundreds of years of humans on the landscape, we really altered that fire regime and even the tree species composition on the landscape. So like Thomas said, we have poplars and red maples on tops of these ridges that are really the mesophytic, wet, cooler trees that should be down in those coves. And so we're trying to shift these drier sites back to what they would have been, and also to make them more resilient for when wildfire moves through this landscape on its own. It's able to withstand the fire and not be so severe and intense that it's destructive to the landscape, but also to our park neighbors and landowners.
And so some of our target species that we're trying to top kill, we've got maple here. We haven't totally killed it, but we've injured it. So this tree, it's a thin bark species. Multiple fires will kill it eventually. Let's see what other species we've got.
We've got a young hickory here, which again is also like the oaks, more fire resilient, fire adapted. And so this is the younger one. It got a little bit of fire damage, but because it's fire adapted, it just shrugs it off and is sprouting again, and it's going to bounce back.
So it's good for us to have a mixed severity fire effects. We don't want to blast everything out the first time around or the second time around. So we're mixing fire effects, using ground ignitions. We use flares and other methods out here too. So.
And this unit's actually, this whole peninsula is fun. Like you mentioned, the flares, it's actually, we get to get on the boat and shoot flares into the unit from the lake, which is not typical.
we initiate aqua squad.
Right.
So.
It's an aqua squad of 1.
No, we got aqua squad of 2. So we have 2 boats, multiple igniters on both boats. So we'll use multiple ignition techniques. We'll use flares. We'll actually pull the boat up on shore, do ground ignitions as well. So we'll actually bump around the whole area. And even when we have a helicopter in for aerial ignition, we have to have a backup plan. So we implement the boats and the flares. an interesting fact about this burn was the first time we actually burned this unit, Linville Gorge actually had a wildfire in it. And so, the U.S. Forest Service was managing the wildfire for ecological benefits, and we had a burn window open up, so the community, they're getting all the notifications about a wildfire in the forest. And so the North Carolina Forest Service State Parks were like, well, we got good burn conditions, and kind of reached out to the U.S. Forest Service. How would you all feel if we did a prescribed fire next to your wildfire? And going back and forth, the National Foresters, we like what we're seeing. We think it's a good idea. So we had a wildfire and a prescribed fire going on right next to each other, and it was a success story.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the difference that we saw when we were driving into the site about the fire effects, the intensity between aerial ignition and hand ignition or ground ignition? Yeah,
absolutely. And so coming in, you could tell with the aerial ignition that we have a more open setting as opposed to where we've done aerial ignition and ground ignitions on the sites. Yeah, so it's kind of hard and it's a shock to the system. You crack open the canopy, but what we've got is we've got oaks, and then we've got some scattered pines, and these pines are actually the ones we actually want to keep. So we got pitch pine, shortleaf, Table Mountain pine, and then we've got a bunch of dead Virginia pine, white pine in here, which this is our goal. It's hard to see this. You got the standing dead, but this is actually heading in the right direction and where we want it to go.
The other super cool thing that's easy to miss in this is how much you've changed the fuel structure. Like, it looks like there's still a lot of fuel out here, but what you're seeing is big bowls of trees. You're not seeing the same density of small stems, of smaller pieces of wood. So what you've got is large pieces of wood, and then you've got really fine fuels with the herbaceous and the grasses, and those are exactly the kind of things that are going to be receptive to fire, that are going to change the way that you operate in the event of a wildfire. This is.
Yeah, the fires are burning under less extreme conditions now. So with the closed canopy, you would have to burn under some pretty sketchy conditions. Now we can actually reintroduce fire following up with more moderate conditions because we have that lighter, flashier fuel structure than the heavier, denser fuels.
This theme of controlled burn units and areas that have been affected by wildfire being right next to each other or sometimes being part of the same property is something we see throughout this region. We headed up to another burn unit in the afternoon that crosses the boundary between the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and the Pisgah National Forest to hear a little bit more about how these partners burn together and the effects they're seeing on the ground.
So you're joining us here on the Lake James Prescribed Burn Unit. This is in McDowell County on the Grandfather District. So Lake James is just south of 2,000 acres. It's about 1,950 acres. 200 of those are Wildlife Resource Commission land. It's been implemented, been burned 3 times. The first time was in 2011, and then again in 2015, and then just recently this past spring in 2021.
This is an area on the state-owned game land, state-owned Pisgah section that we harvested in 2010. It's about 40 acres that we cut, specifically selecting for pitch pine and shortleaf pine here. So it's really unique topography. There's some steep ridges and drainages and also some rolling hills. We're right here on the edge of this Blue Ridge Escarpment. And so we have Table Mountain pine, pitch pine, and shortleaf pine within this burn unit across that elevational gradient. Here within this timber cell area, we've mainly selected for pitch pine, and although there are a good bit of shortleaf out here too. And so the objective of this cell was to remove most of the overstory, which consisted primarily of white pine, and was an off-site species. We came in and removed about 75 to 80% of the overstory, selecting for pitch pine and oak and hickory species, and shortleaf pine as well. And so from a wildlife perspective, is really have seen a huge response in the amount of wildlife. We saw a lot of red-headed woodpeckers, which are very uncommon here in the mountains, show up after we started after the timber harvest and first couple prescribed burns. We've got a lot of early successional bird species that use this area, and from a game perspective, we've seen huge increases in the amount of deer and turkey in this area as well. So it gets hunted a good bit, but we're really proud of this area.
The burn fell under a categorical exclusion that was it was signed for wildlife habitat improvement and or timber stand improvement whenever it was established. And I think the only caveats to that, it couldn't be treated with herbicides and not more than a mile of temporary roads to be established within the burn unit. And so that's why it made sense to do a joint burn with Wildlife Resource Commission. There are some pre-established roads in here, but to simply cut it off, at a forest boundary or Wildlife Resource Commission boundary, you would essentially have a straight line over all this topography. And so, just really doesn't make sense from a management perspective. To try and establish new lines, just use those existing roads that go across those jurisdictional boundaries. Table Mountain pine, pine oak heath, it likes fire, it wants to burn, and so this has been a great opportunity to get fire back where it needs to be on the landscape. I know when this was being planned out, there was some ecozone math that was done, and it focused on areas that were fire prone already, and then also in close proximity to wildland urban interface. And so on the ridge behind us over here, there are some communities and cabins and whatnot. And so this is adjacent to some private property here right around Lake James.
So there's two real big points that I want to make here. Is we're standing in the southern escarpment. So just as it sounds, this entire escarpment is south facing. Those two ridges have the highest propensity of positive lightning strikes of anywhere in North Carolina. So the reoccurrence of natural ignitions in this area are by far much higher than anywhere else that you're going to see in the southern Appalachians. This particular burn on the Lake James burn has not only greatly improved wildlife habitat. I mean, we've got beautiful ecological recovery here. We've got phenomenal game habitat and bird habitat. But it's also drastically reduced the fuels. So in 2015, we had a natural ignition on Bald Mountain, and having this fire as well as the Dobson Knob fire further up the hill really helped us to be able to open the door of what different management tactics we could take, of really understanding what risk was out there and knowing where we could drive that fire and where we needed to control the fire and where we could kind of head the fire into a different direction. So this particular burn is with the Wildlife Resources Commission has a huge emphasis on habitat, but it also is surrounded by WUI. It's also surrounded by residents, and it's been put to work. It's been demonstrated that these types of prescribed burns can meaningfully reduce the cost and the risk of wildfire.
Along with the government organizations and agencies that make all this fire management possible, we also have several RC&Ds, Resource Conservation and Development Programs, that are active in this area. I called up a colleague, Jen Haas, with Mountain Valley's RC&D.
Hey, Jen.
To share her perspective on what we're doing to help the local human communities become fire adapted.
We mainly focus on fire adapted communities, getting communities to identify their risk and then take action to mitigate their risk. And we recently kind of developed a cost share program. And so we learned that wildfire education alone is not as effective, but providing an incentive for them to get work done, a 40% reimbursement, and next year it will go up to 50% reimbursement. That kind of helps them get that work done, because a lot of that work, is cleaning out your gutters, which you need to do anyways. It has a lot, and some of the branches touch the roofs. Like, you need to do that for maintenance anyways, but kind of sharing with them the wildfire preparedness spin on it and other actions they can take to be prepared if a wildfire is nearby. One of the biggest challenges that we run into is convincing people to prepare for wildfire. Fire is a part of the landscape and it's not going away. And so communities have to learn to adapt to live with fire, and we have to be comfortable with fire on the landscape. And so I think it's convincing them and making sure that they're comfortable with fire on the land, and teaching them that fire can be a tool that we can use for land management.
As I was talking with Jen, she used the same words to describe the partnerships that she has with the folks on the National Forest and on the game lands, and that word was seamless. And I work in this area, so I see these partnerships day in and day out. I work to build them, but it was really something interesting that everyone kept using that term, and it made me want to dive more into the story about how these partnerships were built and how they function.
So how did it start?
The partnership has really been driving up in the last couple of years across the board. I think, in my opinion, it's driven a lot by the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. It started out with things like the Fire Learning Network. You've got research being shared, you've got practices being shared. This was kind of captured into Prescribed Fire Council. You know, when it got formalized, you get a lot more interaction. These are the driving forces, you know, towards a lot of this cooperation that's been really seen in the last 2 to 3 years. Nature Conservancy getting on board with a lot of burns. I mean, the benefits of prescribed fire for wildlife, silviculture, and hazard reduction burns, they've been known for a long time. So DOD has been taking care of military installations. North Carolina Forest Service has been helping out landowners. Wildlife has been doing game lands. Parks has been coming on here in recent years, doing more burning than they used to. But it's that collaboration and crossing lines that we're starting to see more of. Cross-boundary burns, multi-jurisdiction folks coming over to help other people hit burn windows. It's been really, really good to see. And I think a lot of that's been driven by not only that sharing of information, but kind of that shared footprint. From a funding standpoint, the Stevens Act, you know, within 10-mile buffer of U.S. Forest Service boundary. Some of that money comes downhill from the U.S. Forest Service. I'm on the mitigation staff for the state of North Carolina, and so our job is to manage that money when it comes in, and whether it's the North Carolina Forest Service doing burning, or in recent times Parks is jumping in there doing some CPP burning. I manage that, so when the burn occurs, all the invoicing comes up to me, and I kind of manage the nuts and bolts of it, verifying that everything was done how it should have been, where it should have been, who should have been doing it, kind of documenting all the process that goes on.
I'll just add one of the most exciting things for me of working in fire in Western North Carolina is the fact that we've got all of our state agencies, all of our NGOs working together on nearly every burn that we have. So I can't think of a burn on the Grandfather Ranger District in the 8 years that I've been here where we haven't had either TNC, Wildlife Resources Commission, North Carolina Forest Service out there helping to implement, not just to be able to help their neighboring agencies to meet those wildlife objectives or those fuels mitigation or ecological objectives, but also because that's their jurisdiction. So these burns are being planned across those property lines, and it's good and it's exciting that all of us are coordinated. We're all relying on those same resources. When we do have smoke in the air and when we have either a wildfire or a prescribed fire, everybody gets a call, and you get that call from those residents or constituents that is whoever they're most familiar with talking to. That's who they call. And it's really reassuring that we're all getting the same responses. We're all talking about the same needs to have fuels reduction, to have this ecological benefit, and it's just incredibly valuable for all of us to be talking from the same sheet of music. And everybody's operating under this assumption of rising waters will lift all ships. Mm-hmm. So the TNC support that we're hearing of, a lot of that funding came directly from the Grandfather CFLR, and so starting up that that on-call burn crew that can help out on private lands, that can help out on state lands, that can help out on federal lands, and being able to shift those resources all over the place to wherever the priority is for that day is a huge flexibility.
Yeah, a lot of our burns in Western North Carolina, they take upwards of 50 plus people, and so it's all hands on deck. We can't do it alone. No agency can really do it by themselves, and so having an on-call crew, state, federal, cooperative partnerships really is how we get it done. One of the neatest things about this area, and a lot happened that wasn't so good, but one of the best things that happened here is this is the birthplace of forestry in the United States, and so I think that's something that we should all be proud of.
Think about that history, about how these partnerships have been built, and also the history of land management in the Southern Appalachians. I couldn't help but think about how in the past, before fire suppression, neighbors burnt this land together. And now we're really just still doing the same thing. We're reinstituting that culture in a new way to manage this fire-adapted landscape the best we can.